We're live.
All right, welcome back to the House Committee on the Environment. We are welcoming George Springston to comment on the Executive Order 625 as it relates to wetlands.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, everyone, for taking the time to listen to me today. Is the audio working well on this? Is this okay?
Yeah, we're all set.
Okay. So I am a resident of Plainfield and a geologist working at Norwich University. And this is just a little bit of background to start with. I've been studying Vermont's wetlands for over 30 years. I started out working for the Department of Environmental Conservation in the wetlands office as an assistant wetlands coordinator, worked there for something over 4 years. And after that, I did wetland consulting work that primarily involved wetland mapping projects. We did a map of Dorset Marsh, which is one of Vermont's premier Class 1 wetlands. I made a complete map of the wetlands of the town of Middlebury, did some other projects for Natural Resource Conservation Service and other places. And then I primarily shifted over to geologic projects with the State Geological Survey. But throughout that work has involved field visits and remote sensing work on wetlands. So I have kept my hand in the game on that, so to speak. And today, I think my emphasis, it's apparent in the written testimony I put together, but I really do want to focus on it, is on the mapping aspects of wetlands, on how we identify wetlands to the extent that we do field visits and that we do remote sensing work to identify wetlands. So that's this work on remote sensing has been a focus throughout my career. When I started doing this work back in the 1980s, down in Massachusetts, working on the National Wetlands Inventory, and this work took place in Massachusetts, New York State, Michigan, Minnesota, Ohio. We primarily used aerial photos. We examined them very carefully with high magnification stereoscopes, and we could pick out wetlands pretty accurately, quite accurately, and produced the standard maps that are used throughout the country. The National Wetlands Inventory maps for Vermont are what ended up being the basis for the Vermont Significant Wetland Inventory maps. I think it's actually good to point out here, when the legislature originally passed the Wetland Act back in 1986, they needed a way, they wanted a way to identify accurately and consistently where the wetlands were. And as in the draft wetland rules that were put together after the act passed, the NWI maps were proposed as being the basis for that. So a study was done in 1988 by the Agency of Natural Resources to look into the feasibility of doing that. And it turned out that they worked quite well. But I'm going to come back to this again, but in that study, they said that the National Wetlands Inventory maps could be a good basis for identifying the general locations of significant wetlands that met the criteria that the legislature had chosen to protect. But that field verification of the actual boundaries was going to be necessary. So, and that's still true today. My the changes to the wetland rules that are currently being proposed by the Department of Environmental Conservation, based on the recent executive order, should be rejected. These changes would dramatically reduce the protection given to wetlands in the designated growth areas and the areas exempt from Act 250 regulation. The rules, as originally written in 1990, the final rules, were carefully crafted to provide critical protection of wetland functions and values, and they were improved further by a series of amendments up through 2023. The proposed changes would dramatically reduce the protection of those wetland functions and values that, I will point out, are mandated in statute. They would also appear to make it very difficult to achieve the stated policy goals in the statute, as amended recently, to include a net gain of wetland acreage and a net environmental benefit to the state. Those changes would work contrary to that. On the issue of mapped versus unmapped wetlands, as currently written, the Vermont wetland rules specify that the Vermont significant wetland inventory maps denote the approximate location and configuration of significant wetlands. And that word approximate is very important. The rules depend heavily on field delineation to identify the actual wetland boundaries on the ground. And that involves a field visit by a trained wetland scientist who looks at the plant species that are present, which vary in their wetland characteristics, the detailed soil characteristics, and the hydrologic signs of flooding, saturation, inundation. And that under the current rules, areas that are known as contiguous wetlands, that is, wetlands that are separated by a causeway or a roadway or railroad, but have a hydrologic connection with a mapped wetland, would also be considered protected. When I worked for the Wetlands Office, the classic case was a large mapped wetland that was shown on the National Wetlands Inventory maps. It might be many acres in extent. And that wetland would have a road cutting through it, and a small piece of it off to the side had not been caught in aerial photo interpretation. But when you would visit it on the ground, it was obvious that it was part of the original, and it had simply been missed in the aerial photo interpretation. Functionally, it was part of the wetland. Originally, it had been part of the wetland. It's simply been divided off. So those contiguous wetland areas are just as important in terms of the wetland functions, such as flood storage or wildlife habitat, or slowing down of stormwater runoff. They're just as important as the mapped portion. And as part of the proposed changes, those areas would not, in my understanding, be protected. And the current wetland rules provide that previously unmapped wetlands, but wetlands that are functionally significant, that is, they fulfill one or more of these functions that are included in the wetland rules that were specified in statute, can be added to the list of Class 2 wetlands that would merit protection. And again, under the executive order, those areas would be removed. So I mentioned earlier that the maps, the National Wetlands Inventory maps that were adopted with changes as Vermont's significant wetland inventory maps were based on remote sensing techniques. And the mapping has been improved in recent years. I really want to applaud the Agency of Natural Resources for undertaking the revisions to the Vermont significant wetland inventory maps using modern techniques. These maps are considerably improved. They're more accurate. They give the public a better prediction of where they're going to find a wetland when they go out on the ground than the old National Wetlands Inventory maps. However, they are not a substitute for on-the-ground wetland delineations. That's just hard to achieve. The things that you can look at doing remote sensing are the color and texture on an orthophoto, even the wonderful LiDAR topographic data. That's the detailed laser topographic data that we now have available to us. That shows the shape of the land, and that tells us a lot about where water is likely to flow, where water is likely to stand. But it's still not the same as being there, seeing what is in the subsurface of the soil, seeing the species of plants that are growing in one spot versus another. So that dependence on remote sensing is a fundamental limitation of even the new, much improved VSWI maps. And I do want to point out that the Vermont wetland rules specifically state that the VSWI maps should not be relied upon to provide precise location or configuration of wetlands. So the resulting boundaries, if you did depend entirely on those maps, would miss parts of the actual wetlands, and they would definitely include parts of non-wetlands. And I would argue that that is not going to help the situation. That's going to result in less protection of wetland functions and values. And it, as mandated by statute, and it's really going to result in greater confusion for developers and regulators, not less.
Representative Pritchard.
Yes, sir.
So are you saying that the Vermont significant wetland inventory maps are incorrect or incomplete or not accurate?
They are imperfect. The original 1988 study showed that, I don't remember the exact number, but over 90% of the wetlands that they tested, that they looked at in the study, as shown on the maps, were actually there and in that approximate position. And that some percentage, over 90% of those, were significant for the functions that the legislature had chosen to protect. So that's the good news. However, the exact wetland boundaries, to take a map that was made from aerial photos that were taken by a plane flying from 6,000 to 12,000 feet up in the air. And those photos on the original maps were small scale. They were scales of something like 1 to 40,000. That means things are quite small. An acre is very small on such maps. To get a boundary accurate within a few feet was simply impossible. The width of the pen lines on those maps, these were paper maps in the old days. I forget the exact numbers. You're talking 100 feet plus just for the width of the pen line. Now, the situation today is better. If you've zoomed in on the orthophotos available on the Natural Resource Atlas, many other sources, you've all seen Google Earth, you can see a lot of detail. But you can't see what species of plant you have on the ground. You can say, I think there's a tree there. You can say it looks grassy to me, but which grass? So the maps are imperfect. And the remedy that we have been using for decades. And as far as I know, the best remedy is to go in the field and actually look at it. And there are wetland consultants around the state who can go out and efficiently map those wetland boundaries. And in the past, I have been on many joint visits between the Corps of Engineers and staff of the Wetlands Office and wetland consultants. And we could usually agree within an extremely small distance, very small distance, of where the jurisdictional wetland boundary should lie on the ground. Does that answer your question?
Does.
Okay, right. So what I'd like to do now is just show you one example. The map up on the screen is from the town of Plainfield. And in the handout that I gave to you all, I had not had time to draw in the wetland boundary, which is shown in red up there. So I just put the label wetland in several places on there. My wife and I live on the east edge of Plainfield Village. And let's see, does my cursor show up there fairly well here?
Right.
Okay, so let's see, just for orientation, here's a scale of 500 feet. At the bottom, Plainfield Village is just to the west. We live right here. So I know this land well. It's owned by friends of ours. It's directly across the street. The green polygons down in the south here are wetlands that were picked up on the recent improvement of the Vermont Significant Wetland Inventory maps. Those are actual wetland areas. That's the good news. And there, the southern boundary of that's probably pretty good. If you went out on the ground, I think you would see some differences of some feet as to where the southern boundary of that is. However, based on my observations over many years walking these fields, and based on the red line, which is a wetland delineation by a wetland professional done last year, the wetland actually extends well north of the green wetlands up into here. These areas in white beyond here are non-wetland. It extends through here, all through here. Here's a piece of the wetland boundary here, and they didn't bother to do it. It wasn't necessary, but the wetland boundary would have come around something like that. So my point in showing this is there are several acres of wetland that actually is definite. It has the soil characteristics. It has the vegetation characteristics. It has the wetness. My wife and I walk out there, but we have to wear high boots unless it's the middle of the winter. And it's true in the drought this summer, we could walk across there dry shod, but that was exceptional. And the reason why I bring this up is not because it's just some curiosity. This wetland, I would judge, has important functional importance in terms of slowing down stormwater runoff. The slopes are low, the vegetation is dense. Places like that slow down the runoff of stormwater considerably. When we get a large rain through there, I can see the water moving out through. There's an outlet in the northeast corner of it, and it takes days for that water from one big rainstorm to really make its way out. I can see it get wet quickly, but then it takes days and days to dry out. That is significant. That's what the legislature was trying, one of the functions the legislature was trying to protect. So development of wetlands like this, which are not shown on the VSWI map and would not be, and it's in a growth area or these, village areas, it would not be, development of wetlands like this would mean that instead of slowing or storing stormwater, more water would move downhill more quickly towards Plainfield Village. And we've already have enough problems with flooding in our village. The unintended consequence of relaxing the wetland rules to favor this sort of development would be repeated over and over again in growth centers around the state if areas like this do not receive protection as wetlands. This isn't just a little increase of a little fraction of a wetland. It's several acres. It's over 6 acres of wetland in this particular area. I would suggest that in many senses, our wetlands shouldn't be thought of completely as obstacles to overcome. They are, among other things, protective natural stormwater features. So again, the VSWI maps are much improved and they're a great basis, but they need field verification. And so the rules should not be amended to take that away. I have 2 more points I'd like to make if I can. The 50-foot buffer rule, the standard 50-foot buffer for class 2 wetlands should not be reduced to 25 feet. 50 feet is barely sufficient in some situations. In particular, in residential areas, it's risky to reduce it further. I think again and again, we see that intrusions into buffer zones are pretty likely in residential areas anyway, and to cut it down to 25 feet means it's more likely you're actually going to be intruding into the wetlands themselves. So in conclusion, I'd like to just reiterate that many of our village centers are in and adjacent to the mid-size and larger river corridors. And if we want to reduce the impacts of heavy rains and floods in our downtowns and villages and protect water quality, then we need to protect these wetlands. So I really think I can wrap up there, except I will say in conclusion, as currently written, the Vermont wetland rules go a long way to protecting critical functions and values of wetlands that the statute is asking them to protect. So that should be maintained. Thank you for listening.
Thank you for your testimony.
Thank you.
I have a couple of questions for you. You know, we hear a number that an estimate of 35% of the wetlands in Vermont have already been lost. And I've heard that's a conservative estimate. Do you know anything about that estimate? And yeah, like how we've lost them?
I know that's the number that we used years ago. I'm pretty sure that it comes from the status and trends studies that the National Wetlands Inventory did, but I was actually wondering about that myself and realizing I don't know the source of it. It probably is higher. And the way that our wetlands have been lost, many of them were very reasonable sounding ways. They were drained to improve agriculture. They were filled for roads and houses. All of the development that we've done since the founding of the state, it's living on the land. Some of that has involved draining and filling of wetlands. And when you do a small amount of that on a landscape, it probably has a minimal impact. But as the acreage impacted gets larger, the functional impact gets larger. One thing that I do have experience with that helps me feel confident that protecting our wetland acreage is important is when you do watershed modeling using the technical models that predict what the peak flow is going to be from a watershed. All of the models that I'm aware of that the USGS and the Natural Resource Conservation Service and the engineers use have a factor for the percentage of wetland in that watershed. And you can just see as you change that factor, they've found from doing the studies behind those models again and again, that if you want to increase peak runoff in a watershed, lower the percentage of wetlands. You can kind of play with the tools and see what happens. And it's because that many wetlands, not every one, but many wetlands in many watersheds, they slow down the movement of water or actually store it. And has been pointed out in some testimony before, it's part of the base flow of our streams as well. When we saw streams still flowing at near the end or the late stages of the drought that perhaps we're, in some sense, of course, we're still in, but when we saw streams flowing in August, part of that water was making its way slowly out of wetland areas.
Or at least the groundwater that they recharge.
Yeah,
Absolutely. Yeah.
it's complicated.
Yeah. Another thing we hear a fair amount about, or we've heard with this EO, is the seasonality of the wetlands delineation process, kind of being an impediment to development. Can you walk us through someone getting how it works when someone needs a delineation and they need to hire someone to do it?
I will take it as far as I know it.
Well, our next guest can do this
And
too,
your
so I really feel like
your
maybe we
next
can,
guest can do it.
maybe we'll let them do that.
We'll leave it to her.
Right.
She's totally up to date on that.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much for your testimony. And George, I just want to take a moment to acknowledge you and your life's commitment to Vermont's environment and how you've been quietly working behind the scenes on so many things that we consider in this committee. And that I've touched your career along my path. I was a new college graduate when you were doing the wetland inventory at Middlebury. And so I
Really?
remember that I remember it. Doesn't surprise
Oh my
me you don't
gosh.
remember it. But then more recently in the river management program, and I'm sure lots of things in between that I'm not aware of, but thank you for all your work.
You're welcome, Amy. Great.
That we would like to welcome the DEC Watershed Management Division, Wetlands. If you'd like to sit there together, you're welcome to. I think you can swing this chair around if you like to have this red chair here is be fine.
Morning, everyone. I'm Laura LaPierre. I'm the Wetlands Program Manager at DEC, and I've been in that role since 2013. So I've been involved with a lot of the newest updates to the Vermont Significant Wetlands Inventory. I led a 6-year stakeholder group reviewing changes to the Vermont wetland rules. I've been involved in a lot of Class 1 designations and such. So happy to be here today.
And I know a lot of you. My name is Kevin Burke. I am now the Director of the Watershed Management Division at DEC. Remember that I was the Program Manager for the Stormwater Program in recent years. But I am very privileged to take on this role after Pete Laflamme's retirement. But I'm happy to be here as well to support your questions.
Great. Thanks for coming.
So I do have some slides which I provided earlier today, so hopefully you guys have them. I'll just jump onto the Zoom meeting so I can share.
We had so much fun with you on stormwater.
Still continue that.
Who's the new stormwater person then?
It's under recruitment currently.
We may have you in anyway to talk about.
Yeah, well, we've got some really good staff in the stormwater. You know very well, I'm sure.
You can come in. Jared. Want to join us, you're welcome to.
Thank you, Matt.
You have capacity. If you want to take a chair. Sorry. Sorry.
Oops, sorry, I can't go over my bag.
okay, Laura. No worries.
Am I on Zoom yet? Open.
Yeah, I'm ready like a summer show.
Keep wanting to push that door open and I remind myself, don't.
Yeah.
It's gonna get loud. It's true.
Will. Sorry, share screen. Okay, here we go. So I have a shortened version of some of the presentations I've been giving for the public comment period on the proposed rule changes. I have a list of questions I've been hearing on testimony, so I hope to cover that as well. And of course, feel free to interject with questions as we go. So the public comment period for the wetland rule change closed last night. So that has been finished and there's over 200 comments that we've received. So we'll be going through that in the next stage. So real quick overview of the wetland rules, which I believe you were hearing about earlier, is wetlands are the spaces between deep water and upland areas. And so we need to use soil science, plant science, and hydrology review in order to know where that wetland is. The wetland rules were adopted in 1990 with a 3-tier classification system. Class 2 and Class 1 wetlands are protected under the Vermont wetland rules. They have buffer zones, automatic 50-foot, automatic 100-foot for Class 1 if they are given, if as the default, they can have wider buffer zones going through rulemaking for that. Since 1990, the Vermont Significant Wetlands Inventory was used to determine jurisdiction. It was both those areas on the maps as well as wetland areas that were contiguous to that mapping. In 2010, after the Wetland Investigative Group went forward, it was decided that there should be a more nimble way to identify newly found significant wetlands. And so that rule change allowed for the program to be able to designate Class 2 wetlands that were not mapped. So our work, we regulate any activity within protected wetlands or their buffer zone unless they're considered an allowed use or specifically exempt. We issue permits within those wetlands and buffer zones when there's no other place for the project to locate that component of their project, and where you still have protections of functions and values, and that there's no undue adverse impact to those wetlands, and where there are some impacts, they might be mitigated with compensation. So in September, we received an executive order for promoting housing construction and rehabilitation. And there was a specific section outlining very detailed changes asked for under the wetland program regulations. That was having modifications to the way we regulate wetlands within established designated areas, and require no permit for activities within unmapped Class 2 wetlands, including those areas that are contiguous to mapped Class 2 wetlands, and to have a smaller 25-foot buffer zone for those mapped areas. Since we received that directive and reviewed it, the department decided to go forward with rule change before implementing this directive. So that's where we're at the stage of collected comments before going to ICAR. So the specific edits are in 3 sections of the wetland rules. The big one is the allowed use for residential housing, which is what I'll spend my time talking about mostly. There's also removal of a reconsideration process for like once a permit is issued, someone can ask for a reconsideration before appealing. And we find that duplicative, so that was being removed, and the person can still appeal a permit if they wish to. And section 8.5 is actually something we were contemplating for Act 121, is streamlining how we notice and update the wetland maps. So the allowed use is a new one, and it allows for construction of residential housing projects and related required utilities in these designated areas outside of 25 feet of a mapped wetland area. And there is an additional allowance though for necessary utilities to impact the mapped wetland and 25-foot buffer if they're following best management practices. So this means that the projects that are avoiding mapped areas and the 20-foot, 5-foot buffer, if they're not in those areas at all, they can go forward with their project. There is no wetland program review required of them. It's only within designated areas for residential housing projects. Here are the designated areas as we know them. This is around 6% of the state. It doesn't include all of the sewer service lines or municipal water lines. We just don't have mapping on that. Our website has an interactive map that you can look around in if you have specific questions or areas you want to look at. The really large areas are opportunity zones. Those are sometimes town-wide. Those are in the allowed use if those areas or those projects can hook up to sewer lines, or if they can basically get a wastewater mound for their projects. Here's a close-up of where we are and the areas that would be considered designated areas. And here is our interactive map showing around Essex Junction to give you an idea. So we have this, the pink is the downtown development district. The teal is the VSWI wetlands. The blue lines are streams. And within those downtown development districts, that's Act 250 interim exempt. So that would qualify under the allowed use for residential housing projects of any size, any number of units. Then there's under the Act 250 exemptions, this light pink area is priority housing projects only, where residential projects that are designated as priority housing would be considered under the allowed use. These dark blue areas are transit corridors. They're part of the interim exemptions from Act 250. And those projects are capped at 50 units. So those types of projects would qualify for the allowed use. And then overlaying on that is the sewer service area that extends from the designated areas out. So if a residential housing project could hook up to a municipal wastewater line, those would also qualify for the allowed use. So in effect, these areas where none of those overlays are, you would still need to have a delineation. You would still need to hire a wetland consultant to delineate the boundary and then design your project. Those areas circled here that are overlaid, those a developer would use the wetland maps only, design their project and construct if they're avoiding those areas as an allowed use. George had a good example earlier of out on East Hill Road in Plainfield. This is another site in Barry. So you'll see here the teal area is the updated Vermont Significant Wetlands Inventory. The orange is the delineation that was provided. So I think it's around 60% of the actual wetland area within the blacked outlined area is only on the delineation, not on the mapped VSWI.
I was gonna try to get through the presentation before we had questions.
Okay.
What's your preference?
Either way, I can come back to the slide too.
Let's get through it.
Okay. So we had questions earlier this week about the statewide update. So here's an overview. We have added the Missisquoi River Basin, that's the starred area, in 2023 as part of a wetland rule update, which also included a way for us to be able to do bulk updates of our mapping. We've completed national wetlands inventory level mapping for the entire state. We finished that this fall. It was a huge milestone for us. We had.
Help us understand the difference.
Yeah, the National Wetlands Inventory is run by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. They have nationwide protocols for mapping wetlands, and all of the mapping that we produced with our contractor who does mapping throughout the entire country has been adopted to the National Wetlands Inventory. So you can use that today. The original VSWI was actually just the National Wetlands Inventory. And since then, we've been adding delineations and work from the program since then, as well as some updates from the National Wetlands Inventory. And I'll get more into like the scale and some of the details of how they do it too. But that's a good question. So that was completed just this fall. The summer, we added this area outlined in red. So the National Wetlands Inventory, plus retaining all of the delineations that we've added to the wetlands map, are now on this map. This green area is what I'm anxiously awaiting, is big chunk of the state. We're hoping to get that up for public notice very, very soon. We have to have a 30-day public comment period. We'll have an interactive map so people can look at their sites and see what the mapping is changed to. So we should be seeing that soon. In the rest of the state, we're hoping to notice and get up onto the VSWI by the end of 2026. along with that national wetlands inventory mapping, we have quite a backlog of delineations from permits and site visits that we're working to get onto the maps. We've had the ability to edit the maps since 2012. And we're just finally getting momentum and more capacity to be able to be adding those more in time as we get them. So George was talking about scale. I wanted to show you some maps showing the scale. So the original National Wetlands Inventory was a 1 to 40,000 scale. So basically, people were looking at maps like this and drawing where they could see wetlands. If it was a paper map, that would be 1 square inch would be equal to 250 acres. Oh, sorry, this is in Milton. And just for reference, that blue blob is the designated area. So zooming in to current National Wetlands Inventory scale, which is 1 to 12,000, that would be 1 inch on your paper map would be 25 acres. You can see a bit better where the wetlands might be, actually, like up in this corner. That's really nice. You can see it's a conifer forest, and then there's open wetland there. So whoever was drawing the map saw that and drew it. Going even closer though, like they have to do it at a 1 to 12,000 level because they're doing the entire state, the entire country. So they can't zoom in as close as our program staff can. And this blue area is some draft mapping that the wetlands program has drawn at a 1 to 3,000 scale, which we can do using the latest aerials. We can use elevational data, LiDAR, as well as field information and boots on the ground. Like, for example, if you were to look from this street looking east, you would see all this red osier dogwood, alders, wetland plants, which you can't see from those higher scales. Okay, so we had a question earlier about how we go about reviewing projects. So I have a project. This is my last slide. This is something that we permitted just a week or so ago, so I figured I'd pull it up for us to look at. This is a Top Notch Resort. They came in for a wetlands permit to add some condos. This is in a designated area as well. So this would be in an this would be in an exempt or allowed use area. So what we did here was we reviewed the delineation. Top Notch hired a consultant. They delineated it in May. They contacted us and we did a site visit in June to review the delineation. So the teal area is the wetland. The orange area is the 50-foot buffer zone. And the dark gray areas were the proposed project components, which are primarily outside of the wetland and buffer zone. The pink areas are the areas that we had permitted within the buffer zone. So you see this is a completely forested wetland with some pond area. And they were able to design a project. We were able to review based off of the functions and values that the wetland had, which include water storage, surface and groundwater protection, erosion control, aesthetics, wildlife habitat. We were able to say that this project in these wetlands could be in the same area, and we issued a permit for it just January 6th. So that's generally what our process is for reviewing sites. Sometimes, especially like in disturbed areas, it can be difficult to find the edge of the wetland a bit because vegetation is mowed, for example, and we might have to talk it through with the wetland consultant to either understand their perspective or to change the boundary. So that sometimes happens.
Was this wetland on the BSWI inventory? Do we know?
It was not. So it is contiguous across the road. There's a mapped area. We had permitted some earlier work here in 2023. We did not add the wetlands to the maps. We haven't gotten to adding them to the maps yet. But because the delineation was over 5 years old, they redelineated, we re-reviewed it, and that's what was put into the application.
And does this perform, I mean, does this help the developer also meet their stormwater permitting requirements?
The stormwater permitting requirements, I'm not specifically familiar with what permits were required. Top Notch does have stormwater permits. And this being new development would have triggered new requirements, new design to capture those impervious surfaces. The wetlands permit would have considered any of the impacts associated, let's say they had to cite some stormwater infrastructure or other infrastructure. That would have been collectively considered in the wetlands permit. So ideally, if there is stormwater infrastructure that was required, it would be wherever the wetlands permit allowed them the impacts, whether to buffer or wetlands.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for this project, none of the stormwater infrastructure impacted the wetland. It looks like it's all parking and access roads.
So this wetland would have been not considered under the proposed new rules because it wasn't mapped. It could have just been developed.
Correct, under the allowed use, it would qualify under the allowed use.
I have a lot of questions. Thanks for your presentation. First one I saw was Representative Tagliavia.
First to this slide that you have up. With respect to the permitting, is the Goodyear storm taken into consideration with when you look at this map in regard to the permit for the condominiums?
For wetland permitting, we're
Yes.
reviewing what the impacts are to the wetland and buffer zone. So we don't look at storm events specifically. We're looking at what the specific activities will be doing to the functions and values.
Okay,
Stormwater permit would typically look at the storm events.
stormwater, okay.
Yep, and it really depends on the size of the expansion and the drainage area of the receiving water. Generally speaking, predominantly most stormwater permits don't have to address the 100-year storm. Usually caps out at the 10-year storm under the existing standards. It would take, say, 10 acres of new impervious to trigger the 100-year.
Okay. Let's see if I mean, on slide 6, the allowed use housing areas. That's with current land use maps. We're right in now with the regional planning commissions and the future land use maps. There's new designations and stuff like that. How will those new maps potentially, when they're finished, affect this percentage? You said with respect to this slide, it was 6%. Is it going to increase or decrease that number?
I'm not sure of that. I can ask and get back to you, but the executive order lists the interim Act 250 as well as the Tier 1A, Tier 1B zones that will be designated this year. So my understanding is that a lot of these designated downtowns, village centers, they're going to be mostly looped into those, tier 1A, tier 1B. But in addition to those Act 250 exempt areas, there's the opportunity zones, the areas of municipal septic and water line that extend beyond those areas, which could foreseeably be extended further by a municipality and likely qualify. So it could expand.
Representative Pritchard.
Thanks for your presentation. So I'm sure this is just a small snapshot of stuff that you do. My question is, how much wetlands have been added either by acres or percentage just in the updated delineations? Because there was a lot of teal on a few slides.
Yeah. So I have a percentage that we had when we were doing the updates for the Winooski and the Otter Creek. We're in the Winooski watershed here in Montpelier. And the net change, some of the VSWI being so zoomed out, didn't have details. So some areas of wetland were moved, some were added. For the Winooski watershed, it was 145% increase in identified wetland area. And in the Otter Creek, it was 20%.
145%. Can you just?
I can send you the handouts that we have from when we did that public notice. You can have that information, the exact acreage and such. It's important to note that, like, currently, if a wetland is significant, it's class 2. It doesn't need to be on the maps. So that addition to the VSWI, which the Winooski, a lot of that mapping was from like the 70s. So the technology really, really improved. So we're able to provide landowners much better notice of what's on their property than then.
And that was a reason for my question, because perhaps we haven't lost as much wetlands as we think we've lost. I mean, right in that example, you've identified 145% increase. Maybe we just haven't updated in,
Well, the 35%, going back to Sheldon's question before, was a report to Congress, I believe in 1990, 1991, when around the time when nationally we were working on a no net loss goal for wetlands. And that was from like the 1700s up until the 80s. They had just completed a lot of the mapping for the country at that point, but there were still areas that hadn't been mapped. So they weren't using the mapping to determine that. A lot of what Vermont was actually NRCS data, the soil conservationists who were working on draining wetlands for farmland. So there was that, as well as notes from the colonial era. Like, they used a lot of interesting information in order to get to that 35% in Vermont, and they weren't using the National Wetlands Inventory. And I can provide that for the committee to see that report.
Just one more question. How long have the classifications, trying to word this right, been in place? I mean, is this something that we've always had these same classifications, or if there's been added classifications, or?
So the wetland rules came into place in 1990 with the 3-tier classification
Okay.
system. Yeah.
Okay.
Representative Chapin.
Going back to that slide on page 6, where you are estimating 6% of Vermont is in those areas covered under the EO. have you overlaid that with wetlands areas? Do you have a sense of how much of our wetlands are in those areas?
That's the difficulty of unmapped wetlands.
Yeah.
Or even just?
We know that I anticipated this question, I have an answer. For mapping, we have 14,000 acres of mapped wetland within these red spots on the state.
Do you know of the mapped wetlands currently, what percentage that is? One of my questions.
what
Is
percentage
it a
of-
higher percentage of our wetlands than our area? I'm sort of presuming is the case, but.
Okay, well, you stumped me there. So I'll
You
have to
said
get.
14,000?
Yeah, 14,000 acres of mapped wetlands within designated areas. The percentage of the total mapped wetlands, I don't have that.
And
So,
then
go ahead.
I have a different question. Did you want?
Yeah, no, go ahead.
Coming back to sort of how these rules would impact adjacent properties or in like in your case of Top Notch, the current properties, existing stormwater systems where there's been development and they've created stormwater management plans for those properties. And this obviously might be more of a question on the stormwater team, but because we were asking this question the other day and just trying to understand where you have development and then you're looking at an adjacent development that would be basically altering wetlands areas because of the EO and these rules. Those existing properties with development, is there a stormwater management plan for the property sort of dependent on adjacent wetlands? And will it impact those other existing properties that have already done the work to sort of engineer their sites and plan and maybe do some constructed facilities to manage stormwater?
Sounds like your question, and correct me if I'm wrong, is when you have a project, we'll just, that's an example that obtained a permit and did have some impacts, but predominantly avoided. There's an adjacent property. Are you looking to understand how the wetlands permit, those permitted impacts impact the adjoining property owner?
No, I'm asking about in the future. So if Top Notch if the rules went into place and Top Notch did the same project, but didn't need a wetlands permit because it was an unmapped class 2 wetland. And so they just decided to leave that wetland over. But just downhill, there's a property, theirs or another person's property that already went through development and got a stormwater management plan and engineered the site for that to manage stormwater. And I'm presuming that the ability of Top Notch uphill, if they didn't need a permit in the future and engineered the site really differently to reduce the impact of that wetland, might be affecting particularly a downhill developed site. And so I'm trying to understand, because we have this entire system for stormwater management that's affecting lots and lots of homeowners and property owners. And it's sometimes really expensive and challenging, that allowing an uphill site to no longer need to get a wetlands permit and avoid building over a wetland might dramatically impact neighboring properties.
And stormwater permits are, they're taking into account the change in runoff from pre-development. In most cases, they're collecting their development runoff and providing some water quality component, but also maybe providing some channel protection or peak flow control. So the stream would see that the peak, say, for the 10-year storm is no greater than what it was pre-development at the discharge point to the surface water. If there's uphill development and wetlands were impacted, there certainly could be more water because there's less flood storage. Ideally, it wouldn't be routed to that development, but it would potentially affect what the stream sees. The EO wouldn't affect, project needing a stormwater permit. So it's possible that they would still be controlling their runoff from their developed lands. But if there were wetlands impacted, that might be a separate piece.
Because wetlands store water, they don't just, it doesn't just flow over the wetland. The impact on that isn't really necessarily taken into account in the stormwater permitting process and how it might affect an adjacent property.
Only in the sense from, you know, if the wetland disturbance or filling was part of the comparison from pre-development to post-development conditions, it might be considered that, you know, it's now a parking lot versus an undeveloped wetland area.
I'm gonna ask a few of my questions. I have a high level question and then I have nuts and bolts. I'm trying to figure out which to ask first, but I would say, I have real concerns with creating. I have concerns about your staff capacity and, the illusion that this is going to somehow expedite development. When we've, I think, just now created, if this comes into being, a somewhat arbitrary land use designation division between how we regulate our wetlands. And that your division will end up spending an awful lot of time with jurisdictional opinions related to land use, not ecological function of our wetlands. So I guess I'll start with, how many inquiries do you respond to annually? How many permits do you issue? And how many staff do you have today to do that work?
All right. So I have my report from last year, where we had, over 1,800 technical assistance calls that we reviewed. And sorry, I should start with, we have, oh man, number of staff.
Give me approximate, doesn't have to.
Yeah, like around 8.
Around 8.
Yeah.
Or 1,800 technical assistance calls.
Yeah, and we did 766 site visits in 2024, the field season, with some special winter calls with that.
I'm sorry, how many site visits?
766. We had 240 permit decisions that in 2024.
I do think one point I would like to make too is that, you know, permit decisions might not necessarily be reflective of the work that might not result in a permit. So a lot of their work is ideally working to a solution that doesn't require a permit.
Because you issue a permit when there's an impact.
Yes.
And otherwise, if they don't impact the wetland, they don't need the permit. To be clear.
Or
Yeah,
buffer.
right. So if they do their homework up front, provide the delineation, demonstrate they're not affecting the wetland, they're good to go.
Mhm.
So those site visits are affirming some of that work, I see.
I think, you know, there's planning development is, you know, it's a delicate balance. We're talking about stormwater infrastructure, there's wastewater infrastructure, water infrastructure. And, you know, the mapped wetlands and additional data layers really can provide a developer or a single property owner with some information to begin planning for avoidance. But it's very complicated because, you know, I think whether it's a single family home or a larger development, in the end, the project needs to be viable for its intended purpose, whether it's X number of units or house with ability to access. Some parcels are very constrained and they might still have to impact the wetland in order to develop their parcel. So it's a difficult balance.
Can you speak to how this will change your process if this is implemented?
I was looking at our database recently, and close to half of our permits are associated with housing. I don't have that broken out based on designated area versus non-designated areas. But that is the majority of the work that we do in the program is reviewing housing development. So it would be a big difference. And there would be certain areas of the project that, of certain areas of the state that the program would not review for wetland presence.
How do you imagine this would interact with, or how often do you interact with the Army Corps with Class 3 wetlands? And how will this change that process for property owners?
Yeah. One more thing to your last question. I just thought of is like, we're spending a lot of time right now, taking former delineations and putting them on the maps within those designated areas. So that's another shift that our program is having. For the Army Corps of Engineers, I'd like to say that we're like different layers of Swiss cheese. Like they have holes of different protections and we do too. And together we work well together. In a lot of cases, we do things exactly the same. They don't have classifications. We're not looking at specifically waters of the US. We're separate regulations. When a project has enough impact for the Army Corps to come in, so they have some self-reporting permits for lower levels of impacts. This top-notch project did not involve the Army Corps at all because they did not impact wetlands directly. It was all buffer zone work. So that's within our shop, not in their shop. We will work together if there's impacts to the
Rewind.
wetland. Yeah.
If you weren't having any jurisdiction because this was in place, what would the Corps do? Would they evaluate the project at all?
If there were impacts to waters of the US, if there was draining or filling,
Drilling, dredging,
if
building?
there was, yeah, a dredge and fill permit is their stuff. So like if you just cut the trees,
So if
that's
this-
your only thing for your project, that's not jurisdictional. But if they're placing fill in the wetland, that would trigger the Army Corps and they would review general permits and individual permits, but not the self-reporting permits that are smaller impacts.
So this wetland gets filled because of the development that's now allowed in an unmapped significant wetland. They need a Corps permit.
Yes. Now there's a lot going on at the federal level right now. There's just a rule change for waters of the US, which is proposing that only wetlands with surface water during the wet season would be considered jurisdictional for the Army Corps. So think about like your wetlands that have hummocks and hollows, and there are some areas that do pond and other areas that are just saturated soil. They would use the same delineation methodology, which us in the Corps align with, but if that rule goes forward, then they would only be regulating dredge and fill within areas of wetlands that had inundation of water puddling areas. So Top Notch did have a pond in it. So if those rules change and they impacted the ponded area, yeah, they would be involved. It's a little uncertain where that's going, and waters of the US has been kind of sifting sands for quite a while.
Although we tied our regulations to existing last year, and so that would, I don't know what, wouldn't change the federal involvement, but we tried to hold on to what was working. My last question for now is, we in the Flood Safety Act have asked for rulemaking to proceed on a 2-to-1 mitigation ratio. We've been told that there was lack of capacity at ANR, and I guess I'd like to know where you are with the rulemaking process that was requested prior to the EO on statutory changes we made to support wetlands.
Yep, so we have been working on a draft. We were getting really close this September. Originally, the goal was to have something reviewed and out for stakeholders to review, before the legislative session. The executive order in September changed priorities.
You have a question?
Yeah.
Representative Sackowitz.
So we have these areas which are unmapped, but the mapping is like a constant work in progress, right? And
Yes.
and areas are being mapped and added to the database over time. And so areas that are unmapped right now at the time that the executive order would go into effect when rulemaking is done and everything's approved, we wouldn't sort of freeze the areas that would be allowed to be developed under those rules. As unmapped areas become mapped over a period of time, those would then become areas where you would now need a permit. Is that
Yes.
right? Do we have a sense of, I think we probably touched upon this already, but of what the magnitude is of the unmapped areas compared to the mapped areas, and how that might change in the relatively near future, given the updating of the maps, the current maps?
There will always be unmapped areas. As good as we get, with technology, wetlands change, even delineations are only valid for 5 years. So it's simply just not possible to have a map that accurately depicts precisely where the boundary is of a significant wetland throughout the entire state. We are certainly getting a lot better at it, and that is extremely helpful for landowners and people planning either for conservation projects or for development projects. It's helpful for everybody. But it's not it could never replace a field delineation.
When the executive order first came out and I first became aware of it, and before we've had a lot of education in terms of how this all works, the initial sense, and I suspect this is probably shared by a lot of people, is that unmapped in some sense correlates to not as important. And I'm wondering if that is part of the reason why the executive order was structured the way it was. But what we're hearing, and what I think we heard very clearly from the earlier presenter, is that that's very much not the case, that there are really important wetlands that are unmapped. And so I guess my question is it possible that we will see, assuming the executive order goes into effect, that there will be construction in wetlands that has significant effects for water quality, flood control, things of that nature, that we automatically assume would sort of be the case in the mapped areas, but would now be possible in these unmapped areas?
Yes, we know that unmapped wetlands provide significant functions and values, and that's been one of the biggest drivers for changes to the wetland rules, the past two larger rule changes since 2010. The aerial interpretation, you can see where there's ponded areas like really well, and you can draw a circle around them, but your important seepage, forested wetlands that are recharging water into streams and providing cool water for fish. Those are harder to see. Vernal pools, which are essential for specific amphibian species, are often forested and very small and hard to pick up with aerial mapping. Yeah, we can't assume that staying out of mapped areas will cause no net loss to wetland function.
So the short answer, thank you for that response. The short answer is then, yes, it's possible that we could have significant effects from development in wetlands under these new rules.
Yes.
I just actually need to also follow through on my question as well. So when will you get to the mitigation 2-to-1 rules? So if they were put on hold, when will we expect to see that? Can we expect to see those?
I don't have an answer for that.
Yeah, that's a tough question. I think it's most certainly on our radar. It's really important. Not only, statewide, it's really important. Outside of the executive order, it would be key to ensuring that we don't have a net loss, but have a net gain. The opportunity for restoring impacted wetlands, I think, is part of that. It's a challenge, I think, in terms of staffing. I think there's a lot of directive to implement what I think is, our leadership certainly wants to support. For new housing and development, we're just trying to strike the right balance.
I appreciate the position you're in. I have one more and then I'll go to others. Are you currently reviewing housing developments in designated areas that have been affected by unmapped wetlands?
That have been affected by unmapped wetlands, typically, multifamily housing projects that come to us. We get contacted by the wetland consultant asking us to review a delineation. So new projects, savvy developers know that's the first step before you design your project. There are some housing projects that were placed on hold when the housing bubble burst in 2008. Those are actually still coming back online in some cases where they received their Act 250 permits and may or may not have needed a wetland permit. But in 2010, when the rule changed to include unmapped wetlands, we've had to revisit those projects since our delineations and permits are good for 5 years. 5 years had passed, they need to come back to us. And in some cases, they've had to redesign those projects for avoidance and minimization and come in for wetland permits. So those have been kind of the more difficult projects that we've worked through. There aren't any that we're saying, no, you can't do anything now. We just have to work with redesigns, and most of those have now been re-permitted.
I want to get to folks who haven't asked any. I think you're one of them. Representative Nor.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and Laura, again, thank you for your presentation, very helpful. I just wanted to follow on with Representative Chapin's question in terms of the percentage. And thank you very much for having that 14,000 number. That was exactly the number that I was looking for as well. And I know you didn't have the total, but a quick Google search, which I just did, shows that Vermont has about north of 300,000 acres of wetland. I'll leave that up to you to confirm, but that's what Google said. And so the percentage is about 4.6% of our wetlands are in the red designated area. So if we paved over 100% of those 14,000, all 14,000 acres, we would be, at worst case, impacting 4.6% of our wetlands. But I would submit that given the example project you put up, the top-notch project, we really tried to avoid the wetlands as much as possible, but likely people are gonna do that just because it doesn't make sense to build in the middle of a pond. Or a wetland, so, yeah, worst case, 4.6%, but probably significantly less than that in terms of our impact by the red areas.
Well, except those are the mapped wetlands. We're talking about unmapped wetlands.
Yeah, and which is a 14,000 included, right?
No.
No, 14,000 is the mapped area.
We have no idea what the unmapped ones are. They're not mapped.
Yeah, and like for a little more context, our permitting program throughout the entire state in any given year permits to the square footage of wetland loss. So like we might see 2 acres of wetland impact in a year based off of our efforts to avoid, minimize, and mitigate wetlands impacts.
Present, I'm gonna go back in order. Tagliavia.
Going back to the slide you have up in the allowed use housing area and that 6%. And following on with Representative Pritchard's question about, I think you said there was 145% gain and the other was a 20% gain. How are those gains going to impact, or could they impact the 6% regarding allowable housing or allowed
It
housing?
means in those parts of the state, which I had a later slide showing that red circled area. That's a increase in wetland detection in those areas. So the designated areas in those part of the state have better identification of where the wetlands are. That it doesn't mean that there's 145% more class 2 wetlands in the Winooski. It means that that's how much more we've been able to identify.
Representative Pritchard.
So I just wanted to make sure I understood this correctly. It sounded like you have 8 folks on your team. Are those 8 folks the same 8 folks that field the 1,800 calls, do the 766 site visits, and issue the 240 permits?
Yes.
Okay, so those 8 folks do all that stuff.
And we also assess the condition of wetlands. Those staff do that work. They also do compliance enforcement work. They also do outreach. I'm very proud of them. They're a really awesome team.
What's the maximum number of staff you've had in the wetlands historically, in the wetlands office?
This year.
8 ever is the max.
No, well, we also have 2 temporary staff who've been helping. We have 1 full-time bioassessment and mapper staff.
Her program is staffed with wetland ecologists that do a lot of the regulatory work, and then there is some other staff that do some of the support work.
But you're talking about total, there's 8 plus 2 temps right now. Ecologists to office folks. Yeah. Representative Austin.
I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the balance that you had mentioned before. That it's a balancing act. Do you believe it's possible to preserve and protect the wetlands and meet our housing goals? And I know it probably depends where we're talking about.
Yeah, it's a tough question. I think mapping provides really, the advancements in getting new maps out there provides a lot more predictability for project owners. Wetlands, as Laura spoke to, have a lot of different functions and values. And one of which George spoke to was, managing runoff and precipitation. So I think it really is going to depend on the functions and values of a particular wetland in a particular area, the watershed, as to what, what the impact would overall be, which I think is really, where minimization comes into play. But there are, from my work in stormwater, certainly overlapping with wetlands, there are really qualified engineers and designers that recognize the challenges, but have a sense as to how to avoid and strike that balance. I think, an effort to really improve our maps, even though it is not an on the ground delineation, I think advancing our map updates can really help identify what areas are best for development. Understanding there will be impacts.
Chapin.
So, quote, a lot of us are trying to figure out, and then just want to summarize again and maybe get a little more detail here. The pros and cons, and sort of housing, the benefits towards housing versus the impacts on wetlands and all of the functions that wetlands provides. So I guess I am been hearing yesterday and today a lot of clear evidence-based information about the impact on wetlands and the wetlands functions of the EO and these proposed rules. I hear some hypothetical benefits to increasing the number of housing projects that would happen on the ground, but I haven't heard any evidence that there are projects that don't go forward or people who don't come forward with projects. Partly because, and we've heard some direct testimony saying, why would a developer want to develop in that wetland anyway when that causes all these problems for development? So I guess what I'm asking you, and what I just heard you guys say, so correct me if I'm wrong, is that generally when people are trying to develop housing, whether it's a homeowner or a larger scale developer, that they're working to delineate wetlands and then figure out where on the site to put the infrastructure. And you're not like turning people away and saying, sorry, that parcel isn't buildable. So I guess I'm curious if you have any evidence that these rule changes, lots of evidence that the new mapping will make streamlining development, make the process better for developers. That seems really clear. Everybody agrees that updating the wetlands maps helps at least initially guide folks who are thinking about developing. That's what I'm hearing. So, and we want those updated maps. It's great for everybody. But are these rule changes going to really do much to increase the number of housing units that come online? Or from your perspective in the wetlands division, do you have any evidence that that will happen?
I'm not quite sure of your question. Like, if there's less areas that are regulated, someone might be putting in more units, like
So I understand that
yeah.
conceptually the concept is there that might happen. And I'm asking about evidence. Like, you turned 5 people away from being able to develop on their property period last year because of the ground.
It's more the size of the project. So once you know where your resources are, then you know the max build out of a site. Sometimes a lot has more wetland areas than what they desire to be able to build. And so there are some cases where they might be removing a unit or two. There are some postage stamp lots out there that are almost entirely wetland, and an individual land purchaser should be steered away from those sites for building housing. They might be able to do something smaller like a hunting camp, or sell it to a conservation group or something like that. work really hard to provide that sort of information. We have an online screening tool so people can type in their address and get all sorts of information on whether there's hydric soils, there's wetland mapping, there's rare species in that area. So when people go to purchase property, they know that there's, well, sorry, I'm going kind of beyond what your question was.
So what I'm hearing is you see on occasion some scaling down
Yes.
with a few projects here and there.
I think it's important too to note that, it's often the applicant that really is going back to the drawing board and understanding sort of what they can do to maintain viability. Program is often put in a position where, they'll see the initial proposal, the impacts are great. And there's, some back and forth to get to a compromise where it still remains a viable project for the developer. And we often don't get into the details on their end as to why that is. But I think they work closely with trying to find a reasonable path forward.
Just a comment and maybe something to add to the question that Ella has. These are not the only constraints that could be on a particular development property that we're talking about. We're talking about depth of soil to ledge because of your need for septic, talking about topography and slope also. So my concern is this, like you mentioned earlier, it's critical to find a balance. It's just all I wanted to add.
Thank you for your work on behalf of Vermont's wetlands. I know that we value them very highly and appreciate. Seems like we should talk about staffing at the Wetlands Division in more depth at some point soon. But thank you for coming in today.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right, members, that completes our testimony for this morning. Back on at 1:15 this afternoon.